Thank you. And finally, Konrad Hirschler of the Free University of Berlin on documentary life cycles, reuse of Mamluk legal documents.
I give it a try.
Which one?
That one. Let's see what it works. Yeah, thank you very much, Jonathan, for having agreed to chair this panel, and Daisy for having organized this panel. Do you hear me at the back? Or? Okay. So my paper focuses on archival practices and the question of document preservation in the Syrian lands, in particular Damascus. And for Bilal Sham, the question of who preserved and did not preserve documents, for what ends, and in what context, and in what forms, is particularly pressing. As compared to Egypt, obviously, we have fewer legal or state governance-related documents which have come down to us from the pre-Ottoman periods. Certainly, we do have vast amounts of documentary material from the realm of scholarly practices, and Garrett's paper was a wonderful example of what can be done with that material, and indeed, it seems that Syria has generated a particularly high number of these documents compared to other regions, so in that regard, Syria is much more on the map. However, when it comes to legal and governance-related papers, the situation is much more difficult. We have some collection of material from the Christian ecclesiastical institutions, the monastery in Jerusalem in particular, but we do not have anything comparable to the corpus of Waqfiyat as they exist in Cairo, and we do not have the papyrological material such as that in Vienna, which contains a considerable amount of Mamluk period texts, but is obviously mostly concerned with Egyptian affairs. And even more distressingly so, the largest corpus of Syrian Mamluk period legal documents, and that's obviously the Haram al-Sharif documents, was, as Christian Müller has shown in his meticulous study, and in contrast to what many of us had assumed and had hoped, it's not an archive, but it's a rather random collection, or not that random, but it's not an archive, but it's set up in the framework of a corruption case. So in order to enlarge the documentary corpus and for being able to address the question of the archive in a meaningful sense, two main approaches have been taken so far. The one possibility is to work with Ottoman period registers and documents to extract what they have absorbed in terms of Mamluk period paperwork, and this approach has gaining traction with reference to Egypt in particular, and Nicolas Michel obviously has been working on that. But for the Syrian lands, has not been done so much, and the main projects of which I'm aware is the ongoing project by Mathieu, Elodie, and Astrid on the Ottoman period register of waqfs related to the Umayyad Mosque, which has incorporated a lot of material from the Mamluk period, and which will be published this year, as I heard. The second approach which has been taken was to focus on the often very fragmentary material that has survived in the Qubat al-Khazna in Damascus, of which a number of publications have come out over the last years by the Sodels and Jean-Michel Mouton on the basis of photographs which are held in Paris, so it's a very complicated story. So these are Damascus paper transported to Istanbul, photographed in Istanbul, and now in photograph in Paris. And this is clearly groundbreaking material, virtually the first larger group of documents referring to pre-Ottoman Damascus, which is available right now. However, this is a rather small corpus. For example, the marriage-related documents, which came out in 2013, these are 62 documents, and often they are of very fragmentary nature. So what I want to present here today is another venue to enlarge the corpus of Syrian documents, namely by identifying documents that were reused or recycled in Damascus during the Ayyubid and Mamluk period, taking up the previous work on Egyptian reused material, which was brought to light by Frédéric Baudin. In 1993, Sotheby's sold these noteworthy pieces of Latin medieval fragments which have Arabic titles of them. This is one of the examples, which is a work of canon law by Burkhard of Worms, which does not interest us here. But the interesting bit is the Arabic title, which is Asabi wal Ashrun Ba'd al-Miyya fi Dhimn al-Dhawi al-Wijhayn Imla al-Hafiz ibn Asakir, i.e. a hadith collection against the hypocrites by Ibn Asakir. Today this is in the Skoyen collection. And this lot is quite interesting because virtually all these titles which are on there are referring to Damascus material, so they have a clear link to Damascus. And indeed, it did not take too long to identify the manuscript from which this title page was taken, and that's today in the Assad Library 3758, which is the unique manuscript which exists in this world of Al-Majlis Asabi wal Ashrun Ba'd al-Miyya fi Dhimn al-Dhawi al-Wijhayn. Today we have no time to deal with the exact history of these Latin fragments which went to the Skoyen collection. The main point is the Latin fragments are only a very small part of what was going on in Damascus, and we much more frequently find the Arabic material being recycled in manuscript for a whole variety of different purposes. We don't have time to go into the materiality of what was going on here. Suffices to say that scribes reuse documents and other fragments for a wide variety of purposes, such as individual title pages, which we have seen, or as protective wrappers around choirs. They produced entire choirs out of these documents, or they used them as sewing guards in order to support the binding. In this case, for example, a marriage contract was recycled to produce a new choir. So you have the large writing, that's the marriage contract. In the interlinear space and on the verso of the document in the small writing, you find a hadith collection, one of these very small hadith compendia, as they were so typical for the post-canonization period, which Garrett has discussed in his PhD. And the beauty is that in many cases, the producer of the new manuscript reused the entire document so that we not only have fragments, but that we can actually reconstitute complete documents with all the prosopographical, legal, social information preserved. This contract, for example, is quite noteworthy as it took place between wealthy families who originally came from Persia. They were migrants of the second generation. And they calculate the gift in what they call the red new Isfahani Sultani dinars, a currency which has not been attested for Damascus yet. What happened here is that the new user cut the document into 8 sheets. That's basically the grid lines which I've superimposed on the documents, and stacked these new folia on top of each other to produce a new choir. Here another example of a sale document that's a real estate deed in Damascus. On the left-hand side, you see the document, and on the right-hand side, you see poetry by a Damascene judge and his mashyacha, which has a more complete list of his teachers. If we reassemble it, you can still see the lines where the old document was cut into pieces in order to produce the paper for the new document. That's again, in terms of content, quite fascinating because this is a legal dispute which occurred in the family after Muhammad ibn Abdurrahim, whom we don't know, died, and his widow and her father-in-law got into a very nasty dispute over the property, which centered around the widow's claim that her deferred marriage gift, the Sabaq Mu'ajjal, had not been paid, and she is still entitled to receive it. And you can imagine that there's a whole lot of prosopographical but also topographical data in this document. The document refers to the sale of a shop to the north of Bab al-Faradis in Damascus, and what is to be done with the proceeds out of this sale. there's a second document which refers to the same case, which was recycled in another manuscript, which is today a completely different manuscript in Damascus. Interestingly, the two manuscripts, the two documents do not refer to each other, and they're complete separate, but it's clear that a high number of paperwork was produced in the framework of this case, and that this paperwork made its way into Damascene Hadith manuscripts at a later point. Overall, I've identified so far roughly 400 fragments, which will significantly enlarge the corpus of Damascene legal documents. But what I want to speak today is not so much the legal side and the content side, but what this has to do with archival practices. The answer to the question, what has this to do with archival practices, is twofold and has something to do with, firstly, from where the reused documents were taken, and secondly, for what purposes they were used. Okay, for the first point, from where did the scribes source the documents which they reused in order to produce their new manuscripts? It is striking that the corpus of reused legal Arabic documents is very similar to the Kubbat al-Khazna documentary corpus, i.e. the material which we know which came out of the Kubbat al-Khazna. I.e. in both cases we are talking mostly about legal documents concerned with marriage in all its different facets and with real estate transactions. That's the vast majority. That's about 90% of the Arabic material coming out of the Kubbat al-Khazna and out of the reused document corpus. Then we have a small number of very diverse other materials, such as private letters, for example, the odd petition, but that's really the exception. But most striking is what is not there in both the Kubbat al-Khazna material and the reused corpus, and that is there is nothing on trade and there's nothing on governance. And that's very striking because the Kubbat al-Khazna is obviously a geniza. It was used as a depository of paperwork within Damascus. And in the mother of all genizas, in Cairo, that's obviously focused on trade material and on governance-related material. So this geniza must have had a very different purpose from and very different function within communities from the one in Cairo. So what we have thus are two corpora of Damascene documents, the Kubbat al-Khazna corpus and the reuse corpus, which have a very similar profile. And in my view, it is fair to assume that the reuse corpus probably does go back to the Kubbat al-Khazna as well. And this assumption is further supported if we look at the non-Arabic material. I only talked about the Arabic material. But obviously from the Kubbat al-Khazna we also have quite a large corpus of Latin, Greek, Syriac material which has come out over the last years, not from the Kubbat al-Khazna, from photos which have been taken 100 years ago. That's another complicated story, but we have now quite a large corpus of non-Arabic material going back there. If we look at the non-Arabic material which is reused in Damascene manuscript, it's again very similar. For example, the Latin material is virtually all Frankish period manuscripts, liturgical manuscripts, produced in the Middle East in the framework of Frankish Crusader societies. It thus seems that the communities of Damascus had something akin to a document depository at the heart of the cities, where some kinds of documents were deposited, namely legal documents on marriage and divorce and real estate transactions, but where other documents, decrees, commercial matters, were decisively not deposited. And it seems that this was not a one-way depository where you just put stuff, but that scribes used the Kubbat al-Khazna to source writing and binding material, i.e. it's a two-way geniza. Okay, now to the second question, for what purposes were documents reused by Damascene scribes? The commonsensical argument would be to see this as a merely opportunistic practices, i.e. these guys needed paper, cheap paper or parchment, they went to the Kubbat al-Khazna, they got it, they cut it into pieces and used it. And in many cases, this is certainly at least part of the story. However, it seems that the act of reusing a document for producing a new manuscript could also be much more than just waste paper recycling, but it can be seen as the additional stage in a given documentary life cycle and even part of an archival strategy. And that's basically how this material is linked to the title of the panel. Let us go back to the marriage contract, which we had seen earlier and which was cut into 8 bifolia. The striking point is that when we look at the new manuscript in more detail, it appears, so we have a sama at the bottom of the manuscript, and there the owner of the manuscript and the writer isn't named, and this is the son of the couple who were married in the marriage contract. So the Muhammad ibn Abi al-Raja, that's his name, he cut his parents' marriage contract into pieces to produce a new manuscript. Now, this might tell us something about a rather troubled relationship between the son and his parents and about psychology, etc., but that's not what I think is the main story. But much more convincing is that the son, Muhammad ibn Abi al-Raja, reused his parents' marriage contract because it was highly meaningful to him. The new manuscript, which he produced, this hadith manuscript, was a crucial part of his scholarly identity. It was a very important part, and that's evident. This is now the title page of the new manuscript. And you see that in 3 different ways he shows how he is linked to a scholarly genealogy. First, under the title, which is called Sama, but it's not a Sama, and it's a riwaya, where he says basically who the grand scholars are, who are his scholarly genealogy. Then in the middle you have a Qira'a notice, where he transmits the work to his family and to his offspring. And then below you have a large Sama note, where he transmits the right of this transmission to a large group of relatively prominent Damascene scholars. So this new manuscript prominently displays via various paratextual elements his scholarly genealogy, writing this crucial work on fragments of his parents' marriage contract, and a contract which he preserved in its entirety, allowed him to combine his scholarly genealogy, which you have here, with his biological, with his family genealogy. And this booklet acted thus as a CV, so to say, where the reused fragments were not just some random scribbles on the paper, but they have to be read as paratextual elements as much as the riwaya, qira'a, and sam'a, and it's only basically reading them as paratextual element that the manuscript does make sense. In general, it has to be said that in contrast to the Egyptian reuse, which we have seen so far in the previous publications, that the fragments of the Damascus reuse corpus were not reused in informal materials, such as scrapbooks, notebooks, and drafts. But most of these fragments are in hadith collections, i.e. a very odd textual environment if we think about document reuse as an opportunistic practice primarily aimed at sourcing cheap writing material. It thus seems that the documents in the Damascus reuse corpus is not only a significant addition to the number of documentary sources which we have, i.e. just basically building up our corpus, but that they are also highly significant if we look at the material context in which these fragments have come down to us, and that this material context has to be taken seriously as an integral part of the documentary life cycle of the various deeds, etc., which have been preserved. These fragments are not just random survivals, which can be pieced together without taking into consideration the textual and material format of the preservation. And in that sense, reused documents can very well form part of archival strategies in order to preserve the memory of one's family, of one's community, in an entirely new textual format. So while document reuse, ruthlessly cutting documents into pieces, might seem at first glance to be an anti-archival strategy, it can be quite the opposite, i.e. a further stage in the document's life cycle where an archival impetus is clearly evident. And this is not to say that all instances of reuse were meaningful practices and or can be read as archival practices, and opportunistic recycling, sourcing cheap writing material is part of the story. However, there is a clear chronological frame for reusing documentary material, which indicates again that there is a historical story to it. Namely, document reuse was widely spread in Ayyubid and Mamluk period Damascus, but quite strikingly so, it seems that reuse practices for documents in Hadith manuscripts came to an end with the Ottoman period. And obviously the Ottoman period witnessed some changes with regard to documentary and archival practices. So the reuse of documents has to be read in a precise historical context, and for the purposes of this paper, in a historical context with specific attitudes towards document preservation or non-preservation, and thus specific archival and anti-archival practices. Thank you very much.